In this episode, we're going to talk about taking Warcry into the Old World. If you're not familiar, the Old World is the setting Warhammer Fantasy had before Age of Sigmar came along. You can see it in the Warhammer Total War series computer games by Creative Assembly, or in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay line by Cubicle 7. It's also referenced in Age of Sigmar, with the background starting with the destruction of the Old World. This is a well-loved setting that will forever hold a place in many gamers' hearts. So it's no surprise that many of us are looking forward to Games Workshop's attempt to tap into that nostalgia with Warhammer the Old World. This is going to be a full war game with big ranked armies on square bases. On this channel though, we're a little bit more interested in the smaller skirmish-sized games. I'm not holding out hope for it, but I think if GW were smart, they'd release a Warcry Tome of Champions with a Warhammer the Old World section, adding some profiles and warband abilities. Based on the roadmap we've seen, I think it's unlikely we're going to see another Tome of Champions for a while, and the main releases look like they'll be for the expanded Cities of Sigmar army, rather than looking back at the Old World. Luckily, we don't need to wait for GW to release something. As Age of Sigmar has its roots in the Old World, we can take the existing profiles and trim them back to get something that looks a lot like Warcry the Old World. If you're already a fan of Warcry, you might be wondering what the whole point of this is. Above, we've got 10 Warcry specific warbands, and I'm basically telling you to limit yourself to just the Dark Oath Ravagers or the Untamed Beasts. What gives? Well, there are two main reasons to embrace a limit like this. The first is simply because it makes for a fun story, and the second, it shakes up the meta a little and gives us an opportunity to play models we wouldn't do otherwise. To take an extreme example, a Warcry event where everyone comes as Skaven is very limiting but could be tons of fun. You could do this as a one-off evening where you bring 4 Skaven warbands from your own collection and have a big multiplayer game with lots of backstabbing and fighting over Warpstone. If you have a few friends who are willing to do it, you could do a campaign with battles set in the sewers and rewards suitably Skaven-like. The goal, as always, is just to have some fun games. And one thing I find particularly nice about this approach is we are still just playing a Warcry game without any changes. It just happens that we've all decided to turn up as Skaven. A random stranger could turn up to Skaven Slam 23 with their Stormcast list and play, although I'd imagine they'd be very confused. While we have a ton of background and lore to still tap into with Age of Sigmar, the Old World has a charm all of its own, especially if you're a fan of some of the old fiction like the fantastic Gothric and Felix books. It's also worth looking at if you have some friends who never quite got over GW leaving their favourite setting behind and are still resistant to the Age of Sigmar. Or if you have friends who really enjoy the Total War series and are interested in exploring down the tabletop. Games Workshop has made the somewhat controversial decision of only supporting a limited number of armies at release. Those are the 9 listed here. That leaves a bunch of armies out in the cold, which is a real shame. In this video, I am going to focus on this main 9, assuming that we might actually get to see some new models for them. You could definitely put together something for the Chaos Dwarves if you wanted, but since you're not going to be able to get the models easily, it might not be worth it. On the other hand, you do have a massive amount of new Lizardmen that just came out and look awesome, so why haven't GW included them? The reasoning is that they're setting the game in the lands between the coast of Bretonnia to the west and the World's Edge Mountains to the east, and they're doing it during the decades immediately before the Great War against Chaos and the Siege of Prague. So they've got a specific time and theme that they want to hit. That's fair enough. Now, you probably could expand on that, or as I'll talk about in another video, you could focus the game on another area. The first warband we're going to look at is the Empire of Man. For this, we obviously have the Cities of Sigmar list, but we're going to limit our own access to it considerably. In this case, we're only looking at the City of Hammerhall, and we're only going to use human heroes and human fighters. The usual picks for Cities of Sigmar warbands would be Tempest Eye, but we're going to end up having a few of these, so we're just going to leave the Tempest Eye to the side and try use the others. I would suggest using knights mounted on horses instead of the Demigryph knights, but apart from that, you're good to go. That leaves 9 heroes and 10 fighter types to pick from. At Warhammer Fest, we did actually see a couple of lists that would match this. Leonardo Cognigi, for example, went with 2 knights, 2 handgunners, 2 greatswords, and a battle mage, and did manage to win 50% of his games. Next we have the Dwarven Mountain Holes. Again, we're looking at a Cities of Sigmar list. Stick to the Greywater fastness abilities and use the Dwarven heroes and fighters. I would suggest banning allies from outside your own warband broadly, but for the Dwarven Mountain Holes, I'd be tempted to allow a Fire Slayer as an ally, maybe a Doomseeker to stand in as a Troll Slayer for the warband. We did actually see a dwarf go 3-1 at Warhammer Fest, taking the Warden King and 9 Armbreakers. Now, that list did take the Akelian King, which won't be an option here, so you might have to look around for some additional punch. Our first wild card is the Bretonnian list. We have no direct analogy for it. What we're expecting here is knights, archers, and men-at-arms. There are a couple of different options, and it'll really depend on what models we end up getting. We could merge them into the Empire Warband, so they'd be identical mechanically but would have a different look. We could also do the same but give them a different city or variations in abilities, maybe Hallowheart. The last option is to get a little crazy and pick a warband to reskin as Bretonnian. For example, the Luminate Realm Lords have mounts, archers, spears, and sorcerers. It will really depend on what models we get in the end and how they match profiles. The Wood Elves are also in an interesting situation. Rather than having no list, their list is split in two. So we can see some of the classic options in the Cities of Sigmar list with the Wanderers, while the Sylvaneth list has a lot of the tree options. My first instinct would be to stick with the Sylvaneth list and try and make a few adjustments. So we can change the 3 Revenants into just normal generic Wood Elf melee troops. Frustratingly though, we are missing a archer profile. The Gossamed archers are way too fast with their move of 10 and their ability to fly. So instead, I think we backtrack and head back into the Cities of Sigmar, this time using the Living City abilities and only picking from the Wanderer heroes and fighters. This gives us all the typical Wood Elf options apart from the Dryads. If we then allow access to the Sylvaneth heroes, we can get something like a Kurnoth on the table, which will make the warband feel like a real Wood Elf army. For the High Elves, we're again looking nervously back at the Lumineth. For whatever reason, the Cities of Sigmar Elf section just doesn't really cover the High Elves. It's a weird mix with 1 or 2 High Elves and a bunch of Dark Elves thrown in. We want some Dragon Princes on mounts, we want some High Elf archers, lots of Spearmen hold the line, maybe some White Lions with their big axes, and maybe even a Eagle thrown into the mix. The Lumineth list does seem like the best option. We can even take the Stone Guard with mallets as White Lions with their axes, which is quite nice. How do we set them apart from Bretonnians though? The simple answer is we probably don't. And to be honest, that's okay. The goal here is to get some great minis and get them on the table in a way that makes sense. So even if 2 factions do play quite similar, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Orcs and Goblins are the reverse problem. Here we have too much choice. This will be our only entry for destruction though, so there's probably no harm in having a few extra options. I didn't mention it before, but no monster is definitely the best approach. And in this case, the Trolls are 2 Trolls, which are really good to have. So we're going to keep those. We have 2 kind of orcs we can go for, the Bone Splitters or the Iron Jaws. While the Splitters make perfect savage orcs, the Iron Jaws don't quite fit. The Ardboys are straight from the Black Orc kit, but the Brutes are new for Age of Sigmar, and especially once you start scaling into the Megaboss. The Iron Jaws list just isn't as much fun without the Brutes, so I'd suggest just sticking to the Splitters. For the Gobbos, we've got a lot of new models and the fantastic Squig Riders, which I think are new for Age of Sigmar, but they're still in keeping with the madness of the Gobbos in the Old World. As the army list would normally mix the 2 warbands, I would suggest letting them have allies between the 2 rather than keeping them separate. Warriors of Chaos is an expansive one. This is almost the entire Chaos Grand Alliance in a single list. We are of course going for the Slaves of Darkness warband, as the Chaos Warrior is key. I would actually suggest throwing in the Untamed Beasts and Dark Oath Ravagers as warband options. These 2 really capture the Chaos Tribe feel. The generic Chaos allies, monsters and trolls, I'd leave out for the most part, although I do often feel that Chaos Warhounds work well with any of these lists. Personally, I use the Fenris Wolves rather than those weirdly mutated ones, although you do have to change the base size. As the Slaves to Darkness list is so big, I'd suggest not giving it extra options, but you could give the 2 smaller warbands heroes as allies from the Slaves to Darkness list. The Bray Herds are another one of those neglected model lines, where basically everything you could run is already an old world model, so no need to make any changes here at all. Now, what's interesting is that we've massively culled the Chaos options. We've completely ignored all the Chaos gods, each of whom has a mortal and a demon warband. We've also completely ignored the Skaven, along with a number of the bespoke warbands. There definitely is a case to be made for some of those warbands, but the approach GW has decided to take here is that we're limiting just down to the essential core of Chaos. So just Chaos Warriors and Beastmen. Last, we have the Tomb Kings of Khemri. This doesn't really have an analogy in the current rule set, but we can look at the Soulblight Gravelords or the Ossiarch Bone Reapers as options. While both share the Hordes of Skeletons approach to warfare, the Tomb King's use of Ushabti probably makes more sense as the Necropolis Stalkers. The Ossiarch Bone Reapers haven't been doing great in the current format, but this old world format should be a little bit more friendly, so this might be a good opportunity to take that weaker warband and see how it plays. And that was a full list. Yeah, it's a bit weird that we're missing some of what we would consider key armies, like no Dark Elves, Lizardmen, Skaven, or Vampire Counts. Presumably, if the whole thing is a success, GW would look at expanding the game. If you want to, you certainly could do something similar with any of the missing armies. With the warbands we have though, as new models get released, like this Knight and Pharaoh, then we can get some Warcry games in. As we talked about earlier, there are 2 main reasons for taking this approach. The first is to shake up the metagame, and I guess part of that is to give us an excuse to play with some nice looking miniatures that we might not otherwise. The second reason though is to enjoy the narrative elements. So while we focus a lot on the mechanics of the game, once you have an idea of the factions you want to play and some of the miniatures you'd like to use, then give some thought about how the story for this battle is going to play out. There is a wealth of Warhammer background out there, including the role-playing game and the Gotrek and Felix series, which you can also pick up in audiobook format to listen while you paint. Use these as inspiration for some battles. For example, in a few stories, Gotrek and Felix defend wagons travelling through the Empire forests. They get attacked by orcs and all manner of things. In others, they battle Chaos Warriors on the Northern Wastes as they seek to reclaim dwarven treasures. It's fun to do a mission where you collect abstract objects, but when you're rescuing kidnapped children whom the Beastmen are about to sacrifice to their dark god, it becomes something a little bit more epic. If you're struggling for inspiration, have a look at the Necromunda AI video I did, where we used ChatGPT to generate some fun stories. It turns out it also remembers Warhammer the Old World, so it can give some nice ideas on how to generate your story. There are lots of ways to play Warcry, and my favourite is when we're able to get an epic narrative onto the table. When Warcry first came out, it was very much focused on Chaos Warbands in the Bloodwind Spoils, much like Necromunda is focused on gangs in the Underhive. In some ways, it was a blessing and a curse when GW decided to bring in all of the other factions. More options obviously meant more fun, but it pulled us away from that story focused on the 8 points. However, we always have the option of going back. We get to decide, together, what story we want to tell. Since we're expecting some new models for the Old World, I think it would be a shame to not play with them. This isn't limited to the Old World either. There is also a very exciting setting where Dark Elf Corsairs battle vampire pirates off the coast, and Lizardmen battle the Skaven of Clan Pestilence in the temples of Lustria. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible 2-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.